Hello, this is Will Faerber from Art to Ride, and today we're looking at a first submission by Sarah of her horse Charlie. Now, I have seen this before, this horse that is, at the clinic in Montana, and actually I think you've done a great job getting as far as you've gotten here. Um, so, good work so far. We still have a ways to go, but I think you're well on your way. We see the horse is clearly relaxed quite a bit, and you're really on the right track here for the most part. Now, one thing I will say is that the dust here, you have to point out, it's never good to ride in this kind of dust, and it's really kind of sad because it looks like a pretty good arena, but the problem is that dust is very carcinogenic, if you didn't know that, and neither you nor the horse should be breathing that stuff, which is one of the reasons we water down arenas. So think about that, and you can even see him as he goes down. As soon as that dust starts coming up his nose, he brings his head up. So I mean, if there's any way you can water a section of this or something before working them out here, would certainly be an improvement in both of your health. So you always must be aware of that. Dust of any kind is a dangerous thing, so we always want to be careful of that. But you're getting a pretty good stretch here in the walk, and he's relaxed a great deal. Now, you talk about him, he's still chomping at the bit. And no, you don't ever want to use a bitless bridle. That's something we only use on horses with severely damaged mouths, as you can never really get the right kind of contact with a bitless bridle, as you have no real contact except, to the side of the horse's face. And bitless bridles can actually do a great deal of damage to the lower cartilage on a horse's face, so we have to be very careful using those things. It's kind of a wrong idea to think that those are somehow less damaging than a bit in a horse's mouth, or that if you take that off, it's going to calm him down. It certainly wouldn't do anything at all. In fact, it is the rest of the horse will come around before the mouth, if you will. That's why you've seen the improvement that you've seen so far. He's on his way to getting there, and every time he gets unrelaxed, he starts chomping at the bit. So just keep him in the bit you have. I can't really see what it is there, but it should be a loose ring French double-jointed snaffle. If that's not what it is, I highly recommend that you change it to that as soon as you possibly can. But you're getting a pretty good walk here. I mean, he's starting some good stretch. When he stretches down, he starts to overreach a little bit more. It has a little bit of that look, as I like to say, of a little bit stuck in flypaper, if you will, behind it. It kind of a little bit of an effort to get its leg off the ground, and that just means his back hasn't come up much yet. But it certainly looks like you're headed in that direction. So you can even see as you come around there in that dust, he doesn't want to breathe that much. So he brings his head up. So you can see there when the air is clear, he starts to stretch a lot better for you. So, really I just wouldn't work in this kind of environment if you can't keep the horse up out of that dust, or yourself. It's just not healthy. And, any barn owner should actually know that. And to keep an arena like this for people to work in, I fought this my whole life. People want to cheap out and don't want to pay to water arena, but it's really necessary, and really no horse should be worked in this kind of dust, and no people should be breathing it. So be careful about that in the future, because you can see how he doesn't like it every time he comes around there where the wind starts to blow or it comes up his nose, his head comes up. So I think it's coming up more from the dust than anything else. And he starts to stretch down. So in this walk, you want to keep encouraging a little more. As he comes around out of the dust, he puts his head right back down again. So remember to keep working for a little bit longer swing, a little more active swing in this walk. But that's getting better there, and you can see how every time he goes down a little deeper in the stretch, watch how the back legs begin to step more forward and actively. So still encourage a little bit more activity if you can, and try to ask for every time the horse's head comes up. Remember, we position the horse by getting him to step under his body with the inside hind leg. So every time the head comes up, you want to ask him to step over a little more laterally so the inside leg comes under the middle of the body till we find that point that will push up the back. When the back pushes up, it pushes the withers up through the shoulders, and it pushes the head and neck down and forward into the contact. So just keep working for that. And as I said, every time you lose that stretch, just ask for him to step over a little more sideways. But I think you're doing a good job here. You've got pretty good contact with his mouth. It looks like you've got some kind of rain stops or something on those. I would certainly take those off because they're a little bit confusing, and there's never any time you would want to use those things, as in a running martingale or something like that. All those kind of devices, draw reins, running martingales, all of these kind of things were designed for people who didn't know how to ride, so they can ride the front end of the horse by pulling the horse's head down in some manner or other. That may be not what you're doing with these, but as I said, there wouldn't be any time that I would ever advise anybody to use any of those things. Standing martingale, running martingale, whatever the case may be, if that's what those are. It's hard to tell from here. But just bear that in mind for anybody listening to this, that all those things are basically help you to work the horse from the wrong end. That is, if you're trying to pull the head down, it's never going to work. We see many Western riders today, we call them peanut rollers, and that is what is a little confusing for people when they see what we are doing. The Western riders get their horses to stretch kind of straight down from the neck, but usually by using stretchy bands or something to force the head down in front. When the head goes down correctly, it's from the repositioning of the back, not because in any way we are trying to hold the horse's head down. And that's really kind of one of the main points that you can see, that you know the difference between a real stretch and just a horse having its head forced down. Because once again, if even if you did that, if you asked the horse to get active and started to get them swing, you'd probably find that they just pop back up. That is, if you do that Western kind of thing where people have the horse's head on the ground by virtue of force, or however they're doing it with some kind of device to do that. So just bear all that in mind. So the main point is just getting that little more sideward step when you lose it. But as I say, most of the reason he's coming out of the stretch here is because of the dust more than anything else. Horses are smart enough to know they don't want to breathe that stuff. But I really love how calm he's gotten through this work. I mean, he's certainly gotten a lot further along than when I saw you last. So that's really good. He's beginning to take the idea once again. And it's that idea that we're never, if you're forcing horses to do something, you're always forcing to do, they will do whatever they physically can quite easily. But if we start forcing them to do things, then they get very overreactive and they start worrying about every time we're going to ride them what they're going to be forced into doing next. So that's why we never want to use any of those kind of devices. Now, the one device that we do use on horses that are extremely upside down is a shambo. But all a shambo does is when the horse's head goes all the way up and it inverts, it puts a little pressure on the pole and encourages them to put the head back down. But it does not in any way force them down. And if you have it so tight that it is forcing them down, you're not using it correctly. Same situation here. You just see how he doesn't like it all when he has to go through that dust cloud. And as soon as you get through the dust cloud, he goes right into it. So I would highly recommend, if you can't water this arena, just work this horse someplace else, because it's just isn't. It's going to make you sick, and it's going to make the horse sick as well. I understand that, unfortunately, here in California, the same way, we don't have a lot of water, so it's difficult at times, but as I said, you'd be better off working out in the field than working in here with all this dust. But you're getting a good stretch there, and even we're getting a little more activity, so that's good. I'd like to see him do a little more lateral work, as I said. Like, see right there as he starts to invert just a little bit? Right there is where you should be immediately giving a little tap on the side and getting him to engage that inside hind leg a little better. So the big thing I could say here is just keep trying to ask him a little more activity than you're getting here all times. You can see how he stretches so nicely. As soon as he gets out of the dust, he's a happy guy. Then we get a better stretch. So right there, you would want to begin to ask for a little more sideward motion. And in your work in hand, begin to test that at times by, first you want to just be able to move out using the circles. You just move out away from you on the circle. So the next step of that is getting him to listen to the outside rein a little more and step up to it. But there he starts to get a good stretch. He starts to swing a little more. Now that's the best walk we've seen there. It starts to get a little more active. And that's really quite good there. So what you'll see is as this horse gets deeper and deeper into the stretch, you'll find all those bit problems will go away. And of course, just be sure the kind of bit you're using. Any kind of snaffle will kind of work, but the double jointed snaffles are much, much better, as a single jointed snaffle can point up into the roof of the horse's mouth and actually hit him on the roof of the mouth. So that's why the double jointed snaffles work so much better. And just be sure you're not using any of those kind of bits. There's one that we have found called a mylar bit. If anybody has those, you should throw those away or put them on eBay and sell them to somebody else. But those mylar bits, the whole point is they're for people who ride by hanging on the horse's mouth. So they take the pressure off of the horse's bars, and put it on the lips. But the problem is we want to have pressures on the bar. That's where we communicate with the horse through, not through the lips. So if any of you have Mylar bits, every time I go to a clinic, somebody shows up with one of these things, and it's impossible almost to get horses to stretch in them. And I've taken them off of many horses, and instantly they stretch all the way down. So bear that in mind. There's lots of other kind of double-jointed snaffles, but the best are the loose ring snaffle. That's what is the easiest thing in the horse's mouth. It's what I use on all my horses from beginning to end. And a lot of people have the erroneous idea that somehow these rubber bits are easier in the mouth of a young horse, but the problem with most people is they start using the bit too soon. Remember, when we work young horses, should never have any contact on the bit until the horse is totally comfortable with the bit in its mouth. Very much like a child or adult who gets braces, and you have all this metal in your mouth, and takes you a while to accommodate for that. So same thing is true of the horse, but this is getting quite good here. You're getting a good stretch in the walk. So getting back to this idea that then you want to be able to do a leg yield to the outside, but when you can do that, then try to go to the rail and do a shoulder in, so he has to listen to the outside rein a little more. That is, we keep him into the inside a little bit with contact on the outside rein, like he's almost doing there. And that's a really good stretch right there. That's really getting quite active, starting to stretch enough. But we can see with this horse, once we get in silhouette here and take a look at his back, we can see that his back is quite dropped right in front of the hips there. Remember that that's really the first sign of kissing spine, folks. If that continues, that's where basically the spine was dropping down. See how he has that kind of hump and a bit of a dip right there in front of the hindquarters. So you want to see that disappearing, and you will see that disappearing. And any of you who have horses that have been diagnosed with kissing spine, before you do any operations on the horse, try doing 6 months of this work and see if it doesn't solve the problem before you start cutting on the horse. Because if you do, which is what I see so many people doing, is they get diagnosed, they do the operation, they go back to riding the horse hollow again just like it was. If you do that, 3 months later, you're going to have another, the kissing spine is going to come back again because the back is going to continue to collapse out from underneath you. I personally have never had a kissing spine, a horse have a kissing spine operation, and I've literally brought many horses with that back. I'm not saying that your horse has kissing spine, but that drop in front of the hindquarters is the first sign of that happening. And also, of course, tells you exactly how the horse has been trained. You don't have to see a rider ride a horse to know exactly what it's been doing. Like when you see a horse and they walk out of the stall, they have no top line and their back is collapsed. Well, that tells the whole story right there. If you go on my site and look at something of my videos called Recognizing Back Development and get a real good idea in your mind of what that looks like. It's funny because this is not funny, it's sad, but many of the Grand Prix horses that we see today, most of them are completely swayback practically. You only have to look at the rider in the saddle and see the big dip behind the saddle to tell you the horse isn't over its back. But unfortunately in today's world, people seem to have forgotten how to ride horses from the back to the front, and most of them are riding with draw reins and all of these kind of devices, lunging in Nelson Pessoa, these Pessoa rigs, which is one of the worst things. And it's interesting because I see many veterinarians these days who are telling people with horses with kissing spine, they kind of have the idea of what they're supposed to do, but it will never be cured by lunging in a Pessoa rig, because what you're basically tying the front end of the horse to the back end, which creates all kinds of other problems and breaks them in the neck and pulls them behind the vertical. So once again, that was pretty good work there in your walk work, in the work in hand. He was getting some good activity. And going to the trot here, this is quite nice. It's just a little bit too slow. He's stretching down pretty nicely. But see how as soon as he comes into that cloud, he wants to lift his head and get away from that cloud of smoke. Why would he want to breathe that? But he's swinging pretty well, and he's starting to stretch out. And once again, he goes down. So every time the horse stretches down or comes up out of the contact, that is, you want to send the hindquarters away from you. And that's why it's so important that we do this work in hand first with horses if we can. Now, of course, not with a baby who's never had a bit in its mouth. We have to start very slowly with them and get them used to having the bit. But you'll find that when you start babies, as I have done my entire life, within 5 or 10 minutes of the first time you lunge them, they'll start to stretch. So it's people who stop them from doing that. But we just need to see a little more activity, but the stretch is really coming very nice here. It just needs a little more activity when you do it. And as I said, every time the head comes up, you want to send him to the outside. But I think the problem here is more the dust than anything else. Every time he starts to stretch down, the dust comes up his nose as you come around the corner here, then he starts lifting his head again to get away from it. I mean, if you have to yourself, take a hose out in the ring and, water down a quarter of an area where you have some room to work that isn't dusty like this. Coming back to the lunge here, now we can see here the hind legs are nowhere near as active in the walk as they were when you were working the horse in hand. So what you might want to do is get a little closer to the horse, where you can touch the horse a little bit and push the hindquarters to the outside, and then create a little more energy in the horse. And when I say energy, I'm talking about just that little energy. A lot of people will say, go forward, but always remember that forward means to engage forward into the body. That's what we have to do, what we want to do, but first we have to just get them active enough to get enough energy flowing through the horse that will begin to happen. Not bad there. It's starting to pick up, starting to swing a little more. You'll notice that every time the head and neck goes down, we see that he begins to swing a little more behind. So once again, the horse's back guides everything that we do, and therefore also the horse's head and neck. In other words, as he starts to bring the head up, he disengages behind and drops his back. Pretty good there. That's a little better. So I think working a little closer to him maybe might help you a little bit. That is, get a little closer to him on the lunge line so that you can run the lash out and touch him when you need to. And this is a skill that I tell people all the time. The skill of lunging is learning how to use the whip. You need to be able to tap the horse when and where you need it. There's only 3 places we ever tap a horse with the whip. One exactly where your leg goes on the side of the horse, and then in that fleshy part of the buttocks above the hocks there. And then if you're very good at this, if the horse starts to swing out on you, you can give him a little tap on the shoulder to send him back in the other direction. But you have to be awfully good with the whip to do that. So I tell people all the time, take your whip home into your backyard somewhere away from horses and practice with it. Put a little target on something or a fence that's exactly the same spot, about that height that you would like it to where we normally touch horses, which is the shoulder, the middle of the body. So 3.5 feet up, something like that. And get to the point where you can just touch it over and over again, but not slam it with your hand. That is, don't whip them, so to speak. And of course, the other thing is we never want to crack the horse, so crack the whip. So always getting good at being able to use the whip without cracking it all the time, which will eventually, if you're doing it to make the horse go, if you don't ever touch them, they just forget about what the crack means, and pretty soon they pay no attention at all. But all the rest of the horses around you will be going nuts if you keep cracking and cracking the whip. So bear that in mind. So here, once again, I'd just like to see you a little closer to the horse, getting a little more active. But that's pretty good there. Once again, notice every time he starts to go down, it starts to swing. Like right there, starts to look a little better. But you still need to encourage just a little bit more. It looks to me sometimes, remember that you always want to be, when you lunge, at the apex of a triangle formed by your rein and by your whip. So you look a little bit ahead of that position here, but that could just be how it's being filmed there to be able to see where you are. But look at the horse and imagine yourself staying in the center of the horse, so to speak, as you're sending him around you. Yeah, it comes into a good stretch there, starts to get better, but I think you could just work. That means you have to take a longer step when you're doing this yourself. You have to work a little harder. Once they get good at it, they're usually more than happy to do this. And as you say, it was his idea to trot. But once in a while, this horse is not trotting so badly that it's something that you wouldn't want to do. And very often we have horses, they want to go. And, it's a good idea. Think of the idea of reverse psychology. So very often we have horses that just want to go, because this idea, many of them get the idea they're going to run away from everything. And that is a horse's natural defense. They're animals of flight. So, they want to turn and take off. So whenever they're afraid of anything, or if something is hurting them, horses will want to run away from it, even though they may not understand what it is. For instance, if your saddle is hurting the horse's back, they will often want to take off in the opposite direction. Or in any direction, that is. So there he starts to swing pretty nicely. Every time he comes up, the back end begins to fall out, and every time he goes down, remember what we're always looking for. If you put a white dot in the middle of the horse's hocks, When the horse is in a working trot, the hock will make almost a perfect round circle. If it's making an ellipse up and down, it usually means that the horse is falling out behind. But when you get that action, it looks like a bicycle. Like, if you watch somebody in a bicycle, how they go around. That's kind of how it should look, with a nice, even, steady rhythm. Like that. Now, you see right there, he starts to come underneath the body a little more and starts to swing a little better. So that's good. And you come back here to a better walk. So once the trot is good enough, as this was for this horse, it's perfectly fine to use the trot a little bit if he gets a little more energy, and then you come back and you have a better walk. Now, if that trot were absolutely horrible and his head were straight up in the air the whole time, running like a lunatic, I would say don't do that. But this horse is certainly far enough along that it helped him. So that's the kind of rule. You have to get an eye for how this works. If you do a little bit and a little bit of trot and it comes back to a better walk, well, obviously that was a good thing, and it had the right effect. But if he had taken off in the trot running with his head straight up in the air and kind of out of his mind, that wouldn't have had any purpose. Remember, when a horse is not over the back, you have no shock absorbers on the horse. So the faster you go, the more concussion goes directly into the hard tissues of the joints. So that's how so many horses are destroyed today. People start them, way too young. We see all these futurity classes, 3 and 4 years old, and unfortunately, so many horses today, and especially some of the best ones and the most expensive ones, are ruined by these young futurity horses, because the young futurity classes where the judges have gotten in this thing of thinking that a 3-year-old somehow should look like a Grand Prix horse, or the breeders have gotten into this. I'm not sure which, but I think it's a little of both, actually, since our organizations seem to have no clue of when horses are over the back and what dressage really is or not. If dressage is destroying your horse, folks, you're not doing dressage. The whole point of dressage was to train a horse in such a way that it had the lowest impact on his body and the horse would last as long as possible. And remember, all these concepts were developed over years of study at great schools like the Spanish Riding School and Cadremoire in France, the Mafra in Portugal. Every country in the world had a cavalry, school where they were studying how best to train horses. That's what all these schools were set up to. And remember, when we talk about dressage today, that being over the back and having horses, what we now know of as the best way to do this, did not develop until the early part of the 20th century, and was a culmination of figuring out how we could ride cross country and in extended gaits and keep the horse over the back, as opposed to the older types of things that were called dressage. And we remember that the old classical dressage was done in a tiny little arena that was, something like 30 feet across, by 40 or 50 feet long or something. These horses were never coming out. And you see these old paintings of the king, he's, riding around in the school, but go look at what their horses look like. They all look like they were hollow. It was actually cross-country riders coming out of England, these people who rode cross-country and foxing and this sort of thing, who understood getting horses over their backs long before the dressage people did, because once again, your life is in danger when you're going out galloping cross-country and have to really go for miles and miles. If you don't keep the horse over the back, you're going to wear the horse out and probably get killed in the process. As a horse over its back is like a four-wheel drive car. It makes the horse balanced, and therefore if you horse steps in a little hole with one foot, all the weight isn't on the front end, so they don't go down with you. If you're galloping cross country, if you tried to take one of these so-called, we see many things today, is what I'm trying to point out here, that people call classical dressage, and it's nothing but this old form of dressage that was popular before they really understood what dressage really was and how to make the horse go in the best way. So it's something that developed over time. And so we have to understand that aspect of it. And that was what these schools, if you read the Spanish Riding Schools book and things like this, they jump their horses, Same thing in France, same thing in Mafra in Portugal. These poor people, they were trying to make a horse that you could do everything with and would stay sound as long as possible. So that's really what modern dressage is. The two greatest riders of the early 20th century who put all this together were Egon von Neindorf in Germany, and I highly recommend the book that one of his students wrote down his method, so to speak. It's called Dressage Formula. Great book. However, I'm not quite sure that the guy who wrote it actually understood what he was writing, because if you go and listen to some of his videos and things, it just seems to be kind of pointless. But the book is absolutely fantastic. And that was the same thing, why people were so confused. A lot of people don't realize, for instance, like this book from the Spanish Riding School that Alois Padaisky published, which was actually their manual. He took their manual and published it as his own work. And he was never the head rider there. He was a government administrator, and he made himself famous. He did save the Spanish riding school horses by going to General Patton, and that's what made him famous. And people all around the world thought he was some great dressage rider. And that was just not the case. I mean, look at the pictures of him riding. We just recently saw an old video. It was one of these Disney things where it was supposed to be him going out and doing these upper level movements where they jump into the air. My brain's not working this morning. I just got back from Europe, and I'm a little bit on the cold side here. So anyway, excuse me. But anyway, they literally you can see them cut the frame. Somebody else is doing it. Then they cut the frame again and put him back holding the horse as if he has done this, So that's the thing about dressage and why it can be so confusing for people, because many of the people who kind of, locked into dressage and began making a living off of it weren't the best possible riders. Like Egon von Nauderdorff never wrote a book, but his student wrote it all down years later, So these are the understanding the history and how we got to where we are now is very important to understanding how we ended up with the mess that we have now in dressage, where horses are being roll curved and all this kind of nonsense. I mean, they're actually trying to take the walk and halts out of dressage now, to make it easier for the people who are forcing their horses into frames, because the horses are never relaxed. So of course, they hear the crowd respond and they go crazy because they're always looking for where the next blow is coming, if you will. When the horses are not working over their back, they're never comfortable. But now we have a much better walk from what you're getting. We still see there's a little bit of irregularity. And remember, when we say that the horse is in rhythm, we're talking about the two ends of the horse being in rhythm, not the speed at which they're going. A horse can go around the ring at a consistent speed, but be completely out of balance. But that speed will never be really consistent. And why it also looks so mesmerizing when you see horses that are over their back, and it looks so harmonious and draws you into the picture, is when they're not together between the back and front end, as we see in upper level dressage today, where these horses are barely moving their back ends, but they're throwing their shoulders straight out, their front legs straight out. Really what people are doing today in dressage when they call it extensions or extended trot, has much more in common with the old, what we used to call Spanish trot, than it has to do with the real trot. As soon as you disconnect the pairs, that is the diagonal pairs on the horse, that is the outside hind leg, for instance, and the inside front leg, when those pairs become out of unison, you're no longer doing dressage. It's as simple as that. And that's what we've seen dressage turn into in these last 20 years. It's just gotten worse and worse. I mean, things today that people are doing, people would have been, escorted off the showgrounds years ago. And that's why all of a sudden, for the first time, we have people having to have warm-up arenas with 12-foot walls around them so no one can see what's going on. And that's really a shame. Some of the most best things I ever studied, for instance, like seeing Rainer Klimke warm up for the Los Angeles Olympics when he first broke the record, and watching how he stretched the horses, brought it back up. So always remember that if we don't stretch horses, if the muscles are kept taut, the muscles burn out because there's no blood flow. When a muscle is tight, there's no blood flowing through it, or very little. So we have to let the muscles relax again to reoxygenate the muscle itself and bring nutrients to it so it can grow. And that's pretty good. I like to see you keep asking for just that little bit more, and watch that you're not getting a little ahead of his eye, which it looks like sometimes. It may be the camera makes it look there, but it looks like you're a little too far forward when you're lunging and not staying in that place in the middle of the horse's body. There he's starting to swing a little more. Now watch how the back end started to get a little more activity, and it starts to look more regular. When you first started out, he kind of if you watch the back end, it was losing rhythm all the time. And that's looking pretty steady right there, so that's quite good. There, and that's looking even more active and deeper in the stretch. So you will see this horse, over the next year, if you continue this work, you're going to see a big change. Most horses today have never finished their growth cycle because they come in from pasture way too early so that people can sell them and get forced into phony frames, so they don't complete the growth cycle as they would if they lived out eating on grass all the time and constantly moving. That's why, for instance, why Kentucky is such a famous place, because you can graze horses year-round there, so their babies are able to keep moving with their heads down. It's again, the last part of the growth cycle is for the withers to come up through the shoulders, which really brings the back up. And if they never have that happen, it will happen even with a 27-year-old horse if you do it correctly and take the time to do it, because as soon as they do enough work and really start to develop their top line. But that's why it's so important that there's no such thing as a stretch that's too deep. You have to stretch all the way to the top of the withers with the neck in order for that to happen, for the withers to begin to be pulled up through the shoulders and change the shape of the horse. So if you keep doing this work, for instance, this horse will probably be about 2 inches taller a year from now than it is right now. And that whole structure, you can see how even behind the withers there, this horse, the back dips down, and then it dips down again in front of the hindquarters. So that will all change. You see that every time the head comes up, watch how the back end starts looking like it's stuck in flypaper again. So I think everything I've seen here has been quite on track. I think you're doing about the right amount of work. With the work in hand, just go back and try to get a little more lateral work in that, so you're getting moving over when he wants to come out of it. So we get him to step the hindquarters back underneath the body again. But all of this is looking quite good. I mean, comparatively to where you were, you've made a huge leap forward, so to speak, in what he's doing and what you're doing. And you've seen the effect of him, but of this work, even though it's not perfect yet. But you've seen how the horse is totally relaxed in the work, and so he's beginning to trust you. Is also what that means. You know, we see many people who train horses and they go through all this. A lot of these Western guys, and they're always all worried about walking on tarps and all this kind of stuff, because they're having to desensitize the horse to each and everything that they encounter. When horses truly trust you, you don't have to go through all that, because once they trust you, and if we guide them in this way, then they pretty much will do what we want to do. They'll go to horse shows and not go out of their minds and things like that. You can imagine the horse that goes through a lot of different trainers. That, they wonder why they don't want to get in a trailer, because every time they're trailered, they're either sent to some horse show where they go out of the mind, and they spend days being kind of brutalized to try to get them under control. That sort of thing. So once they trust you, things like that all disappear. They just walk into trailers for the most part, because they trust you about what's going to happen to them. I mean, I had a horse some years back that, well, by the time it came to us as a 7-year-old, it had 17 owners were already on this. So you can imagine this horse was just passed from person to person, who tried to force them into phony frames, then gave them up on them and sent them off to somebody else. So as I said, many horses, when they see a trailer, go, oh no, where am I going next? What is going to be the new torture that's going to happen to me? But great job here today. I think you've come a really long way with this horse. And this walk at the end is starting to look quite good. Could be a little bit deeper, but always watching what the effect of the neck has, where that is, coupled with what is happening behind. You'll see how when the hood and neck comes up, you see how the back end just falls out behind. And that's starting to look pretty good there. Notice he's also starting to overreach, and the rhythm gets a little better. So I would say keep doing what you're doing here, and when this gets a little more consistent, let's start to see the same thing in the saddle. Always starting at the walk. Never get out of a walk until the walk is right. And if you get on, the horse is just an antsy mess that he just chomping at the bit to keep going. Get back off and do the work in hand, the lunging again, even if that takes a few times in the same day. As you said, till you can get on the horse and it just relaxes and goes in a nice walk, rather than trying to wear them out to get that to happen. That's always a mistake, because when we try to wear horses out and we use that as a training technique, they just get fitter and fitter and fitter and fitter. And pretty soon, if you have a thoroughbred type horse, if you do that kind of lunging work where the people lunge them for hours at a time trying to wear them out, it just becomes a self-perpetuating process. That is, pretty soon, like if you go down to the Florida circuit these days, you'll see horses are lunged for 3 and 4 hours to get them ready for a class. That's pretty ridiculous. This is Will Faerber from Art to Ride. Done a great job here. I look forward to seeing your next one.